Victoria Chen smiled as she watched Richard Blackwell swagger into the conference room like he owned the place. In exactly 72 hours, he would discover that the quiet woman he'd been treating like a disposable intern actually owned every brick, every computer, and every stock option that made up his precious executive world. But today, she would let him have his moment of glory, because the higher his arrogance climbed, the more spectacular his fall would be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the mahogany table as Richard took his seat at the head, his perfectly pressed Armani suit and gold Rolex catching the light. He was the kind of man who measured his worth in designer labels and corner offices, completely unaware that the woman sitting quietly in the corner taking notes was the one who signed his paychecks. 6 months ago, Victoria had made a decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew her story. She was going to infiltrate her own company, watch her hand-picked executives destroy everything she'd built, and document every moment of their incompetence before taking back control in the most dramatic way possible. The road to this moment had been paved with betrayal, humiliation, and the level of corporate backstabbing that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. Victoria Chen had founded Pinnacle Dynamics 8 years ago in a cramped garage in Portland, Oregon. Back then, she was a 24-year-old computer science graduate with student loans, a revolutionary idea for supply chain optimization software, and an unshakable belief that technology could solve the logistics nightmares plaguing mid-sized manufacturing companies. She'd survived on ramen noodles and determination, coding 18-hour days while her friends climbed corporate ladders at established firms. The early years were brutal. Investor after investor dismissed her as too young, too inexperienced, too idealistic. Banks wouldn't even return her calls. Venture capital firms suggested she might be better suited for a technical role under more experienced leadership. But Victoria had something they didn't understand. She knew exactly what her software could do because she'd lived the problems it solved. Her breakthrough came when Thompson Manufacturing, a struggling automotive parts supplier, agreed to test her prototype. Within 3 months, they'd cut their inventory costs by 30% and reduced delivery delays by 60%. Word spread through the tight-knit manufacturing community, and suddenly Victoria found herself with more clients than she could handle. By year 3, Pinnacle Dynamics was profitable. By year 5, they were competing with industry giants and winning. Victoria had built something special, a company where innovation thrived, where employee expertise was valued over corporate politics, and where clients became partners rather than revenue streams. She'd created the kind of workplace she'd always dreamed of joining. That success, however, came with a price she hadn't anticipated. Growth meant delegation, and delegation meant trusting other people to share her vision. Victoria knew she couldn't scale the company alone, so she began recruiting executives who could handle operations, while she focused on product development and strategic innovation. Richard Blackwell had seemed like the perfect choice for Chief Operating Officer. Harvard MBA, 15 years of experience at Fortune 500 companies, impeccable references from previous employers. During his interview, he'd spoken passionately about collaborative leadership and sustainable growth strategies. He'd emphasized the importance of respecting every employee's contribution and fostering an environment where the best ideas could flourish regardless of their source. Victoria had believed every carefully rehearsed word. Amanda Sterling, her choice for Chief Marketing Officer, had come with equally impressive credentials. Stanford graduate, proven track record in B2B marketing, glowing recommendations from industry leaders. She'd promised to elevate Pinnacle Dynamics' brand while maintaining the authentic relationships with clients that had driven their organic growth. The final addition to her executive team was Michael Torres, recruited as Chief Financial Officer from a prestigious accounting firm. He'd assured Victoria that he understood the unique challenges facing technology companies and was committed to sustainable growth over quarterly profit maximization. For 18 months, everything seemed perfect. The executives took on more responsibility, allowing Victoria to focus on the innovation that had always been her passion. Revenue grew, market share expanded, and industry publications began featuring Pinnacle Dynamics as a case study in successful technology entrepreneurship. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, Victoria began to notice changes. Important strategy meetings were scheduled during her product development sessions. Key decisions were made without her input, then presented as accomplished facts. When she questioned certain choices, she was told that operational details were being handled by the executive team, so she could focus on the, quote, big picture vision. The final betrayal came during a board meeting that Victoria would remember for the rest of her life. Richard had prepared a presentation about organizational restructuring that essentially removed her from all operational oversight. The company needed professional management, he'd explained, to reach its full potential. Victoria would retain the CEO title, but the day-to-day operations would be handled by executives with proven corporate experience. The board, composed of early investors who'd supported her vision when no one else would, had approved the restructuring unanimously. They trusted Richard's Harvard pedigree more than Victoria's intimate knowledge of the company she'd built from nothing. They saw his corporate credentials and assumed they trumped her entrepreneurial instincts. That night, Victoria had sat in her downtown Portland apartment, staring out at the city lights and processing what had just happened. She'd been effectively pushed out of her own company by people she'd trusted, people she'd given generous salaries and equity packages to, people she'd considered partners in building something meaningful. Most entrepreneurs in her position would have fought back through lawyers and board politics. They would have used their founder status and ownership stake to wage a corporate war for control. But Victoria had a different idea, one that was both more elegant and more devastating than any legal battle. She was going to take back her company, but she was going to do it by becoming invisible. The consultant cover story had been brilliantly simple. Victoria Clare, a combination of her middle name and her mother's maiden name, was a highly sought-after business analyst specializing in pre-IPO optimization. Her background was deliberately vague but impressive. Fortune 100 consulting experience protected by extensive non-disclosure agreements, a track record of helping companies identify inefficiencies before going public, and a reputation for thorough, unbiased analysis. The executive team had embraced the consultant arrangement because it validated their importance. Of course, Pinnacle Dynamics was significant enough to warrant elite consulting services. Of course, they were impressive enough to be studied by someone with Victoria Clare's supposed expertise. For 6 months, Victoria had sat in their meetings, listened to their conversations, and watched them make decisions about her company while treating her like sophisticated furniture. She documented every casual cruelty, every moment of disrespect, every instance where they revealed their true contempt for the employees and values that had made Pinnacle Dynamics successful. And now, finally, she was ready to collect. The conference room slowly filled with Pinnacle Dynamics senior staff as Victoria observed from her usual corner position. She'd positioned herself perfectly, close enough to hear every conversation, but far enough away to remain largely invisible to the executives who had long since stopped seeing her as anything more than an expensive note-taker. Janet Morrison, the head of human resources, entered with her usual harried expression. Janet was one of the few remaining employees from Pinnacle's early days, someone who remembered when the company felt like a family rather than a corporate machine. She caught Victoria's eye and offered a small, sympathetic smile before taking her seat. Next came Dr. Patricia Walsh, the brilliant engineer who headed their research and development division. Patricia had been Victoria's first major hire, a former Boeing engineer who joined Pinnacle because she believed in their mission of making technology more human-centered. Over the past 18 months, Patricia had watched her department's innovative projects get canceled in favor of more commercially viable initiatives. The marketing team filed in, led by Amanda's assistant coordinator Lisa Park, a sharp young woman who'd been systematically excluded from strategic discussions despite her deep understanding of their client base. Lisa had been documenting the disconnect between Amanda's expensive campaigns and actual customer needs, but her insights were routinely dismissed as, quote, junior-level observations. Finally, the executive team made their grand entrance. Richard strode in first, his confidence radiating across the room like a physical force. He was followed by Amanda, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor, and Michael, clutching a tablet full of financial projections that prioritized impressive numbers over sustainable growth. Richard called the meeting to order with the authoritative tone of someone who'd never doubted his right to command a room. Today's agenda was ambitious. Final approval of their aggressive expansion strategy, review of the cost-cutting measures that would optimize human resources, and discussion of the consulting arrangement that had been, in his words, an interesting experiment in external perspective.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Victoria's pulse quickened. She knew what was coming. Richard had been laying the groundwork for weeks, making casual comments about the consultant's limited understanding of real business challenges, questioning whether external analysis was really necessary when they had such experienced leadership. The expansion strategy presentation began with Richard's trademark confidence. Pinnacle Dynamics would double their workforce within 6 months, expand into 3 new markets simultaneously, and increase revenue by 150% within the fiscal year. The numbers looked impressive on PowerPoint slides, but Victoria could see the fundamental flaws that would destroy everything she'd built. The projected growth assumed they could hire and train qualified engineers at rates that didn't exist in the current market. The timeline ignored the infrastructure investments necessary to support expanded operations. Most critically, the strategy assumed they could maintain their reputation for personalized client service, while scaling at a pace that would inevitably compromise quality. Dr. Walsh raised her hand tentatively. Richard acknowledged her with the barely concealed impatience of someone interrupted during an important presentation. "I'm concerned about the technical feasibility of this timeline," Patricia said, her voice careful but firm. "Our current development capacity is already stretched thin. Adding 3 new product lines while maintaining our existing commitments would require significant infrastructure investments that aren't reflected in these projections." Richard's smile was condescending in a way that made Victoria's stomach clench. "Patricia, I appreciate your attention to technical details, but we need to think strategically here. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to achieve transformational growth." Amanda jumped in to support her colleague. "Our market research shows tremendous demand for exactly the kind of expansion we're proposing. The clients are ready. We just need to execute efficiently." Lisa Park, the marketing coordinator, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Victoria had overheard Lisa expressing serious concerns about Amanda's market research methodology, but the young woman had learned that challenging executive decisions was a career-limiting move. Michael presented the financial projections with the smooth confidence of someone who'd perfected the art of making unrealistic numbers sound inevitable. The cost-cutting measures were particularly brutal, reducing employee benefits, eliminating the professional development programs that had attracted top talent, and outsourcing customer service to reduce overhead. Janet Morrison looked genuinely distressed as Michael outlined the human resources optimizations. These weren't efficiency improvements. They were systematic dismantling of everything that had made Pinnacle Dynamics an employer of choice. "The consulting engagement," Richard announced, turning his attention to Victoria for the first time during the meeting, "has provided some interesting external perspective, but I think we've reached the point where we need to focus on execution rather than analysis." Victoria looked up from her notebook, meeting his gaze with the carefully neutral expression she'd perfected over 6 months of invisibility. "Are you planning to terminate the consulting arrangement?" Richard's smile was sharp and satisfied. "Not terminate exactly, but refocus. We appreciate the observations you've provided, but frankly, some of your questions suggest a fundamental misunderstanding of how successful companies operate at scale." The insult was delivered with corporate politeness, but its intent was unmistakable. Victoria was being dismissed as irrelevant, her insights characterized as naive, her presence tolerated only as long as she remained silent and deferential. Amanda leaned forward, her expression showing the kind of predatory satisfaction that Victoria had learned to recognize over the past months. "We've actually identified someone who might be a better fit for our needs going forward. Someone with more relevant experience in scaling technology companies." Michael nodded approvingly. "The transition should be seamless. We're looking at bringing in Alexandra Chen from Meridian Consulting. She has exactly the kind of corporate restructuring experience we need for this phase of growth. Victoria almost laughed at the irony. They were planning to replace her with someone who shared her surname. Someone whose primary qualification was agreeing with whatever the executives wanted to hear rather than providing honest analysis of genuine problems. I see, Victoria said quietly. And when would this transition take effect? Richard checked his expensive watch with theatrical importance. Actually, we've scheduled a brief announcement for later this afternoon. Something about realigning our consulting needs with our growth trajectory. The casual cruelty was breathtaking. They weren't just firing her. They were planning to publicly announce her replacement, as if she were a vendor whose contract had simply expired. No acknowledgement of the work she'd done, no recognition of the insights she'd provided, just a corporate press release about optimization and strategic realignment. Dr. Walsh looked uncomfortable, clearly sensing that something ugly was happening but unsure how to intervene. Janet Morrison was staring at her hands, her expression reflecting the helplessness of someone who'd watched this process destroy other employees over the past 18 months. Before we make that announcement, Victoria said, her voice still calm and professional, I'd like to address some concerns about the expansion strategy. Richard's expression shifted from condescending tolerance to barely concealed irritation. Victoria, I think we've covered the strategic elements comprehensively. Your role has been observational, not strategic. I understand that, Victoria replied. But some of the assumptions underlying the projections seem problematic. Amanda exchanged a glance with Michael, both clearly annoyed that their smooth transition was being complicated by inconvenient questions from someone they'd already written off. What kind of problems? Richard asked, his tone suggesting that any concerns Victoria might raise would be dismissed as irrelevant. Victoria opened her notebook and consulted pages of carefully documented observations. The hiring projections assume you can recruit qualified engineers at salaries that are approximately 20% below current market rates. The infrastructure timeline ignores the lead times for critical equipment installations. The client acquisition targets don't account for the service quality impacts of rapid scaling. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. These weren't vague concerns or philosophical disagreements. They were specific, factual challenges to the foundation of their entire strategy. Richard's face was beginning to show the flush of someone whose authority was being questioned in front of his team. Those are implementation details that will be addressed during execution. Strategic planning doesn't get bogged down in operational minutiae. But these aren't minutiae. Victoria pressed gently. Your job is to observe and report, not to challenge strategic decisions made by experienced executives. The condescension in his voice was so thick it was almost tangible. Around the table, his allies were nodding approvingly, while the actual employees looked increasingly uncomfortable with the public humiliation being orchestrated. Furthermore, Richard continued, his voice rising with the passion of someone delivering a sermon, your apparent inability to understand the difference between strategic vision and operational implementation suggests that perhaps this consulting arrangement wasn't the right fit from the beginning. Victoria sat perfectly still, absorbing every word, every calculated insult, every moment of casual cruelty. Let him have his performance. Let him feel powerful and vindicated and absolutely certain that he'd won. In 72 hours, when the quarterly board meeting convened, he would learn exactly who he'd been humiliating. Amanda, Richard said, turning to his marketing chief with theatrical authority, please prepare the announcement about our consulting transition. I want something that emphasizes our commitment to growth-focused analysis. Amanda's smile was pure, predatory satisfaction. Of course. I'll have something drafted within the hour. Michael nodded approvingly. Should we mention Alexandra's corporate restructuring experience? Really emphasize the upgrade in expertise? The casual cruelty was stunning. They weren't content with simply firing Victoria. They wanted to publicly announce that her replacement was more qualified, more relevant, more valuable than the woman who'd founded the company they were systematically destroying. Dr. Walsh finally found her voice. This seems unnecessarily harsh. Victoria's analysis has been thorough and professional. Richard turned his condescending smile toward the research director. Patricia, I appreciate your collegial instincts, but sometimes business decisions require prioritizing results over personal feelings. The insult extended beyond Victoria to anyone who might defend her. This wasn't just about terminating a consulting arrangement. It was about establishing dominance and ensuring that no one would dare question executive authority in the future. Janet, Richard said, addressing the HR director, please coordinate with security to ensure a smooth transition when we make the announcement. Security. They were planning to have her escorted from the building like a criminal or a security threat. Victoria almost admired the thoroughness of their humiliation strategy. Is that really necessary? Janet asked, clearly troubled by the direction this was taking. Richard's expression hardened. When you're dealing with someone who doesn't understand professional boundaries, it's important to maintain appropriate protocols. The character assassination was complete. Victoria had been transformed from a respected consultant into a potential security risk whose presence needed to be managed through corporate muscle. Lisa Park was staring at Victoria with something that looked like sympathy mixed with horror. She'd watched this process destroy other employees who'd dared to challenge the executive team's decisions. She knew that today's performance was as much about intimidating the remaining staff as it was about removing an inconvenient voice. Any other questions about the expansion strategy? Richard asked, his tone making it clear that further questions would be unwelcome. The silence was absolute. No one was willing to risk their career by defending someone who'd already been marked for corporate execution. Excellent, Richard said, settling back into his chair with obvious satisfaction. Amanda, I'd like to see the announcement draft before it goes out. Michael, let's schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss implementation timeline. Janet, please handle the security coordination discreetly. Victoria gathered her notebook and stood up slowly, maintaining the composed dignity that had characterized her performance over the past 6 months. She'd documented everything she needed. She'd witnessed the true character of the people she'd trusted to run her company. Most importantly, she'd given them enough rope to hang themselves. Thank you for the opportunity to observe Pinnacle Dynamics operations, she said quietly. It's been very educational. Something in her tone made Richard pause, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. But Amanda was already pulling up her laptop to draft the announcement, and Michael was scrolling through his calendar to schedule the implementation meetings. The moment passed and Richard's confidence returned. Security will escort you out after the announcement, he said with casual dismissal. Standard protocol for consulting transitions. Victoria nodded and walked toward the door, her head held high despite the humiliation she'd just endured. As she reached the threshold, she turned back for one final look at the conference room where her corporate execution had just been orchestrated. Richard was already moving on, pulling up his presentation slides and basking in the admiration of his sycophantic team. He had no idea that the woman he'd just humiliated owned every stock option he thought made him wealthy, every corner office he believed reflected his importance, every corporate credit card he used to fund his lifestyle. See you all very soon, Victoria said softly. The words carried a weight that made several people look up sharply, but she was already walking away, leaving them to puzzle over her meaning while security prepared to escort the founder of Pinnacle Dynamics from her own building. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt endless, each floor marking another layer of the carefully constructed identity she was about to shed forever. As the numbers descended, Victoria found herself thinking about the young woman who'd started this company in a Portland garage, surviving on dreams and determination while building something she believed could change the world. That idealistic entrepreneur had trusted the wrong people and paid a terrible price. But she'd also learned lessons about human nature, corporate power, and the difference between leadership and management that no business school could have taught. The elevator reached the parking level with a soft chime. Victoria stepped out into the underground garage, her heels echoing against the concrete walls as she walked toward her deliberately modest Honda Accord. She'd chosen the car carefully, just like everything else about her Victoria Claire persona, to avoid drawing attention or raising questions about her background. Richard drove a Tesla Model S. Amanda had a BMW X5, Michael preferred his Audi A6. All of them luxury vehicles purchased with the generous salaries and bonuses that Victoria's company provided. All of them symbols of corporate success that would soon be revealed as temporary privileges rather than permanent entitlements. Victoria sat in her car for a moment, processing what had just happened. For 6 months, she'd endured condescension, dismissal, and casual cruelty from people who owed their careers to her vision and her risk-taking. She'd watched them systematically dismantle the culture and values that had made Pinnacle Dynamics special, replacing innovation with politics and collaboration with intimidation. Today's performance had been the culmination of 18 months of betrayal, the final proof that Richard and his team viewed employees as expendable resources rather than valuable partners. They'd shown their true nature in the most public way possible, creating a spectacle designed to humiliate not just Victoria, but anyone who might dare question their authority. But they'd also handed her everything she needed to destroy them. Victoria pulled out her phone and opened the secure messaging app she'd been using to coordinate with her legal team. The message was brief, but loaded with meaning. Phase 1 complete. Documentation comprehensive. Proceeding to Phase 2. The response came back within minutes. Board meeting confirmed for Friday 10 a.m. All documentation reviewed and verified. This will be decisive. Victoria smiled for the first time since leaving the conference room. Richard thought he'd won a corporate chess match, but he'd actually been playing checkers while she orchestrated something far more sophisticated. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Patricia Walsh. That was completely inappropriate. Are you okay? Victoria's heart warmed at the message. Patricia was one of the few people at Pinnacle who remembered what the company had been like before the executive takeover. Someone who understood that today's humiliation represented something larger than a simple personnel change. She typed back, "I'm fine. Trust me, this story isn't over." Another message appeared, this one from Lisa Park. "I can't believe they did that to you. Everyone knows your analysis was spot on." The fact that junior employees were reaching out despite the obvious risks told Victoria everything she needed to know about the real state of morale at Pinnacle Dynamics. People were scared, frustrated, and desperate for leadership that actually cared about the company's mission rather than personal power. Her phone rang with a call from Robert Kim, Pinnacle's board chairman and one of her original angel investors. Robert had been growing increasingly concerned about the company's direction under Richard's leadership, though he'd been careful not to interfere with what he assumed were internal management decisions. "Victoria, I just heard about what happened." Robert's voice was tight with concern. "This seems completely inappropriate." Richard called it a consulting transition, but the way he described it sounds more like a termination. Victoria chose her words carefully. "Robert, I think Friday's board meeting is going to be very enlightening. There are some things about Pinnacle's current trajectory that the board needs to understand." "What kind of things?" "The kind that determine whether this company survives the next 12 months. Victoria said quietly. "Can you make sure all board members attend? This isn't something that can be handled through proxy votes." Robert's voice grew more serious. "Victoria, what exactly is going on here?" "You'll find out Friday morning. But Robert, I want you to know that everything I'm about to tell the board is thoroughly documented and independently verified." After ending the call, Victoria drove slowly through downtown Portland, taking the long route to her apartment while processing the magnitude of what was about to unfold. She wasn't just planning to reveal her identity. She was preparing to demonstrate how completely Richard and his team had failed in their stewardship of her company. The financial projections Michael had presented were based on assumptions that would bankrupt Pinnacle within 18 months. The market research Amanda relied on was cherry-picked data that ignored fundamental shifts in client needs. Most damaging of all, the expansion strategy Richard was pushing would destroy the innovation and quality that had built Pinnacle's reputation. But Victoria had more than just financial analysis. She had 6 months of documented conversations, email threads, and recorded meetings that revealed the true character of the people she'd trusted to preserve her life's work. She had evidence of how they treated employees, how they dismissed expertise, and how they prioritized personal advancement over company welfare. Tomorrow, Richard would arrive at work, expecting to celebrate the successful removal of an inconvenient voice. Amanda would finalize the press release announcing their consulting upgrade. Michael would begin implementing cost-cutting measures that would gut the company's competitive advantages. They had no idea that the woman they'd just humiliated was preparing to take back everything they thought they controlled. Victoria pulled into her apartment building's parking garage and sat for a moment in the silence, gathering her thoughts for what would be the most important 72 hours in Pinnacle Dynamics history. She thought about the employees who'd reached out with support despite the obvious risks, about the board members who trusted her judgment even when they didn't understand her methods, about the clients who depended on Pinnacle's continued excellence. Most of all, she thought about the young entrepreneur who'd started this journey 8 years ago, believing that technology could solve real problems, and that business could be conducted with integrity and respect. That woman had been betrayed, humiliated, and pushed aside by people who valued credentials over character. But she was about to prove that vision, persistence, and documented truth were more powerful than corporate politics and executive intimidation. Friday's board meeting would either save Pinnacle Dynamics or destroy it completely. There would be no middle ground, no compromise solution, no graceful transition that preserved everyone's dignity. Richard and his team had chosen to make this personal when they orchestrated today's public humiliation. Now they were about to learn what happened when you declared war on someone who actually owned the battlefield. Victoria gathered her things and headed toward the elevator, her mind already focused on the preparations necessary for Friday's confrontation. She had documentation to organize, presentations to finalize, and a company to save from the people who were systematically destroying it. The elevator doors closed, and Victoria allowed herself one moment of quiet satisfaction. In 72 hours, Richard Blackwell would walk into a boardroom expecting to discuss expansion strategies and cost optimizations. Instead, he would find himself face to face with the woman he'd just humiliated, sitting at the head of the table as the founder and owner of everything he thought he controlled. The age of corporate politics and executive intimidation at Pinnacle Dynamics was about to end. The real question was whether there would be anything left to save after the reckoning was complete. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that should have felt refreshing, but instead carried an electric tension that seemed to permeate every corner of downtown Portland. Victoria stood at her apartment window, watching the city wake up below her, knowing that in 3 hours she would either reclaim her life's work or watch it crumble completely under the weight of 18 months of systematic betrayal. She had spent the previous evening making final preparations for what would be the most consequential board meeting in Pinnacle Dynamics' 8-year history. The documentation was comprehensive, the legal framework was airtight, and the strategic plan for recovery was detailed down to the smallest operational element. But more than that, Victoria had something her opponents lacked: the absolute moral certainty that comes from being right. The shower felt like a ritual cleansing, washing away 6 months of forced invisibility and careful deference. As she selected her outfit, Victoria chose each element deliberately. The navy blue suit projected authority without ostentation. The pearl earrings her grandmother had left her carried personal significance that would ground her during what was certain to be an emotionally charged confrontation. The leather briefcase contained 8 years of corporate documents that would prove beyond any doubt who actually owned Pinnacle Dynamics. At 7:30, Victoria's phone buzzed with a message from her legal counsel, Margaret Sullivan, a corporate attorney who specialized in founder disputes and had been quietly preparing for this moment for weeks. The text was brief but loaded with meaning. All documentation verified and filed. Board members confirmed present. This ends today. Victoria had hired Margaret through a shell consulting firm, maintaining the same careful operational security that had characterized her entire infiltration strategy. Margaret understood that today's confrontation would determine not just Victoria's professional future, but the survival of a company that employed over 300 people, whose livelihoods depended on competent leadership. The drive to Pinnacle Dynamics took 40 minutes through morning traffic that seemed unusually heavy, as if the entire city was conspiring to build dramatic tension for the confrontation ahead. Victoria used the time to review her mental checklist one final time, ensuring that every element of her strategy was perfectly aligned for maximum impact. She arrived at the Pinnacle building an hour before the scheduled board meeting, using her original founder access codes to enter through the executive parking garage. The security system still recognized her biometric data, a detail that Richard and his team had never thought to check when they assumed control of daily operations. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor felt surreal, carrying her past the offices where hundreds of employees were beginning their normal workday, completely unaware that their company's future would be decided within the next few hours. Victoria wondered how many of them had heard about yesterday's consulting termination, how many understood the broader implications of what was happening to their workplace culture. The executive boardroom was empty when Victoria arrived, exactly as she had expected. She spent the next 30 minutes arranging documents at each seat around the mahogany conference table, creating what amounted to a comprehensive case file that would demolish every aspect of Richard's leadership and expose the true cost of his corporate coup. At each board member's position, Victoria placed a manila folder containing financial analyses that revealed the fundamental flaws in the expansion strategy, email threads that demonstrated the executive team's casual contempt for employee expertise, performance metrics showing the decline in client satisfaction under the new leadership, and legal documents that would prove her ownership and authority to make the changes necessary for Pinnacle's survival. At 9:15, Robert Kim arrived early, looking more concerned than Victoria had seen him since the company's difficult second year, when they'd nearly lost their largest client to a competitor's aggressive pricing strategy. Robert had always been one of Victoria's strongest supporters, someone who understood that her success was inseparable from Pinnacle's mission. "Victoria," he said, settling into his usual seat at the table. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. What exactly are we dealing with here?" Victoria smiled, feeling calmer than she had in months. "Robert, in 45 minutes you're going to understand everything that's been happening to this company, and you're going to have the opportunity to help me save it." "Save it from what?" "From the people who are systematically destroying everything we built." The other board members began arriving at 9:30. Each expressing surprise at finding Victoria already present, but politely avoiding questions about her role in the meeting. These were experienced investors who understood that board meetings sometimes contain surprises, though none of them could have anticipated the magnitude of what Victoria was preparing to reveal. Dr. Eleanor Martinez, a former Boeing executive who had joined the board during Pinnacle's 4th year, took her seat with the careful precision that had characterized her distinguished aerospace career. Eleanor had been growing increasingly concerned about the company's technical direction under Richard's leadership, though she'd been reluctant to challenge decisions made by executives with seemingly stronger business credentials. James Patterson, the venture capital partner who had led Pinnacle's Series B funding round, arrived with his usual stack of financial reports and market analyses. James prided himself on understanding the companies in his portfolio better than their own management teams, which made his support for Richard's expansion strategy particularly puzzling to Victoria. Finally, Sarah Chen, the technology entrepreneur who had joined the board after selling her own software company to Google, entered with the quiet confidence of someone who had navigated similar corporate challenges. Sarah had been the most vocal board member in questioning Richard's strategic assumptions, though her concerns had been consistently dismissed as excessive caution. At exactly 10 o'clock, Richard Blackwell strode into the boardroom with Amanda Sterling and Michael Torres flanking him like corporate bodyguards. They carried themselves with the assured confidence of executives who believed they were about to present a compelling expansion strategy to an impressed board of directors. Richard's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to barely concealed irritation as he processed Victoria's presence at the conference table. He had clearly expected her to be long gone, escorted from the building by security and replaced by more compliant consulting services. "What is she doing here?" Richard demanded, pointing at Victoria as if she were some kind of contamination. "I thought we made it clear yesterday that her consulting arrangement was terminated." Robert Kim cleared his throat, his tone carefully neutral but unmistakably supportive. "Richard, Victoria requested to address the board before your presentation. Given the circumstances of her departure, we felt it was appropriate to hear her perspective." Amanda's smile was sharp and predatory. "With all due respect, terminated consultants don't typically get special board presentations. This seems highly irregular." Victoria stood slowly, enjoying the way Richard's confident expression faltered as she walked to the head of the conference table, the position he had undoubtedly planned to occupy for his grand expansion presentation. "Actually," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about my role here." She opened the folder in front of Robert's seat and watched his face transform as he began reading the documents inside. The ownership papers, incorporation certificates, and stock distribution records painted an unmistakable picture that shattered every assumption the executive team had made about their authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria continued, meeting each board member's eyes in turn, "allow me to properly reintroduce myself. My name is Victoria Chen, and I am the founder, CEO, and majority owner of Pinnacle Dynamics." The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. Robert Kim had gone pale as he stared at the legal documents proving Victoria's ownership stake. Eleanor Martinez was frantically opening her own folder, her expressions shifting from confusion to shock to understanding. James Patterson was checking the incorporation papers against his own investment records, clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. Richard was frozen in place, his mouth slightly open, his carefully prepared presentation materials suddenly irrelevant in his hands. The arrogance was gone, the smirk had vanished, and in its place was a growing horror as he realized exactly what he had done. He had publicly humiliated his own boss. He had orchestrated the termination of the woman who signed his paychecks. He had planned to celebrate the departure of the person who owned every aspect of his corporate lifestyle. Amanda Sterling looked like she might be physically ill as the implications crashed over her. Her marketing strategies, her brand positioning, her entire professional identity at Pinnacle had been built on dismissing and undermining the woman who actually controlled the company. Michael Torres was staring at the financial documents that proved Victoria's ownership as if they were written in a foreign language. His budget projections, his cost-cutting measures, his expansion timelines had all been developed while systematically excluding the person who would ultimately approve or reject every decision. "Now then," Victoria said, settling into her chair at the head of the table with the calm authority of someone reclaiming what had always been rightfully hers, "shall we discuss the real state of Pinnacle Dynamics?" Robert Kim was the first to recover, his business instincts overriding his shock as he began to understand the full scope of what had been happening. "Victoria, are you telling us that you've been operating undercover in your own company for 6 months?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Victoria replied. "After the executive team effectively removed me from operational control 18 months ago, I decided to take a different approach to understanding what was really happening at Pinnacle." Sarah Chen leaned forward, her eyes bright with the recognition of a strategy she could appreciate. "You documented everything. Every decision, every meeting, every instance of mismanagement. Every instance where talented employees were dismissed, where technical expertise was ignored, where the values that built this company were systematically undermined," Victoria confirmed. Eleanor Martinez was studying the email threads and meeting transcripts with the methodical attention of someone who understood operational complexity. "This is extraordinary documentation. The pattern of dismissing employee input is clear and consistent." James Patterson looked up from the financial analyses with an expression of growing concern. "Victoria, some of these budget projections are catastrophically flawed. The expansion timeline assumes hiring rates that are impossible in the current market." Victoria nodded grimly. "That's just the beginning. The infrastructure requirements alone would bankrupt the company within 18 months. Richard finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "This is impossible. You can't just spy on your own executives and then ambush them in a board meeting." "I can when those executives are systematically destroying everything I built," Victoria replied, her tone remaining calm but carrying an edge of steel. "I can when they create a culture of fear that prevents employees from voicing legitimate concerns. I can when they prioritize personal advancement over company welfare." She pulled out a thick folder that made Richard's face go white. "This contains documentation of every decision you've made that prioritized politics over performance. Every email where you dismissed employee expertise. Every meeting where you treated talented professionals like inconveniences." Amanda tried to interrupt. "You can't just take conversations out of context and Context? Victoria opened the folder and began reading. This is an email thread from last month where you referred to our longest tenured client as an old-fashioned company that doesn't understand modern marketing dynamics after they raised concerns about service quality degradation. Amanda's face flushed red as the board members turned to stare at her. Victoria continued reading. This is a message from Michael to the executive team, describing our junior financial analysts as number crunchers who don't understand strategic thinking when they identified errors in his budget projections. Michael looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. And this, Victoria said, her voice growing harder, is a recording of yesterday's meeting where Richard called me pathetic and arranged for security to escort me from my own building. The silence was deafening. Even Richard seemed to understand that there was no explanation that could justify what the board was hearing. Robert Kim spoke first, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Richard, is this an accurate representation of how you've been treating employees and consultants? Richard tried to salvage the situation with corporate doublespeak. Sometimes difficult decisions require clear communication about expectations and boundaries. Eleanor Martinez cut him off. That's not what this is. This is systematic intimidation designed to prevent legitimate feedback from reaching decision-makers. Sarah Chen was reviewing the technical documents with growing alarm. Victoria, these expansion projections aren't just optimistic, they're delusional. The infrastructure timeline alone ignores basic engineering realities. Which is exactly what Dr. Patricia Walsh tried to explain yesterday before she was dismissed as someone who doesn't think strategically, Victoria replied. James Patterson was making calculations on his tablet, his expression growing more concerned with each number. The financial implications of this expansion strategy are catastrophic. We're looking at potential bankruptcy within 2 years. Victoria nodded. That's assuming we could even hire the personnel Richard's timeline requires, which we can't at the salaries Michael's budget allows. The board members were now fully engaged, their initial shock giving way to serious concern about the company's future under the current leadership structure. These were experienced business people who understood the difference between ambitious growth and reckless expansion. Richard made one final attempt to regain control. You're all making this more complicated than it needs to be. Yes, some communication could have been better, but the fundamental strategy is sound. Sound? Victoria opened another section of her documentation. Your strategy assumes we can maintain our reputation for personalized client service while doubling our workforce in 6 months. It assumes we can hire and train qualified engineers at 20% below market rates. It assumes we can expand into 3 new markets simultaneously without compromising the quality that built our reputation. She looked directly at Richard. Most importantly, it assumes that intimidating employees into silence is an effective way to identify and solve operational problems. Amanda tried to defend the strategy. Market conditions require aggressive positioning. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions about resource allocation. Victoria pulled out client satisfaction surveys that made Amanda wince. Our client satisfaction ratings have dropped 30% since you took over marketing. Our longest tenured clients are expressing concerns about service quality. 3 major accounts have requested meetings to discuss their quote, evolving relationship with Pinnacle. The euphemism was corporate speak for clients preparing to leave. Eleanor Martinez was studying the employee satisfaction data with the systematic attention of someone who understood organizational dynamics. This is remarkable. Workplace satisfaction has declined across every department, but the decline is steepest in technical roles where expertise is most critical. Sarah Chen looked up from the innovation reports with obvious concern. Victoria, the research and development productivity has fallen dramatically. Patent applications are down 60%. Because Dr. Walsh's department has been ordered to focus on, quote, commercially viable initiatives, rather than the breakthrough innovations that built our competitive advantage, Victoria explained. Robert Kim was reviewing the financial projections with increasing alarm. These numbers don't add up. The expansion budget assumes revenue growth that's inconsistent with the client retention data. Michael Torres tried to defend his work. Financial planning requires making assumptions about future performance based on strategic initiatives. Strategic initiatives that ignore operational realities, Victoria replied. You're projecting revenue from clients we're likely to lose in markets we're not equipped to serve. The board was beginning to understand that they weren't just dealing with management disagreements or personality conflicts. They were looking at systematic mismanagement that threatened the company's survival. James Patterson closed his tablet and looked directly at Richard. I need to understand something. Victoria is presenting documented evidence of strategic errors, operational problems, and cultural issues. What's your response to these specific concerns? Richard's answer revealed everything about his leadership philosophy. James, strategic leadership sometimes requires making decisions that aren't popular with every employee. You can't run a company by committee or let every department head second-guess executive decisions. But these aren't department heads second-guessing decisions, Eleanor Martinez interjected. These are technical experts identifying operational impossibilities. Amanda jumped in to support Richard. Sometimes experts get too focused on technical details and lose sight of business objectives. Victoria almost laughed at the response. Amanda, these technical details determine whether business objectives are achievable or fantasy. Sarah Chen was shaking her head in disbelief. You're dismissing engineering constraints as if they're opinions rather than physical realities. The philosophical divide was becoming clear. Richard and his team viewed employee expertise as an obstacle to efficient decision-making, while Victoria and the board understood that expertise was the foundation of intelligent strategy. Robert Kim leaned back in his chair, processing everything he'd heard. Victoria, what are you proposing? Obviously, the current leadership structure isn't working, but what's your solution? This was the moment Victoria had been building toward. I'm proposing that we return Pinnacle Dynamics to the principles that made it successful. Merit-based decision-making. Technical expertise valued over political maneuvering. Employee input respected and encouraged. She gestured toward the documentation spread across the table. These people have been documenting the real problems facing our company while the executive team focused on expansion fantasies. Dr. Walsh has solutions for our infrastructure challenges. Lisa Park understands our clients better than our marketing department. Janet Morrison knows exactly what's destroying our workplace culture. Richard looked desperate. You can't just overthrow experienced management because you disagree with strategic decisions. I'm not overthrowing anything, Victoria replied calmly. I'm exercising my authority as the founder and majority owner to remove executives who have demonstrated incompetence and contempt for the company's mission. She pulled out employment contracts that made Richard's face go ashen. These agreements include termination clauses for failure to perform duties in accordance with company values and objectives. Michael Torres tried one last desperate argument. You can't prove that our strategies wouldn't have worked. Business always involves risk. Victoria's smile was cold and professional. Michael, your budget assumes we can hire senior engineers for $45,000 below market rate. That's not risk, that's mathematical impossibility. Amanda made her final stand. Market research supports aggressive expansion in our sector. Market research that ignored client feedback about service quality concerns, Victoria replied. Market research that assumed we could scale without compromising the personalized attention that differentiates us from competitors. The board members were exchanging glances, clearly reaching consensus about what needed to happen. These were experienced business people who understood the difference between calculated risks and reckless endangerment. Eleanor Martinez spoke first. Victoria, the board supports your resumption of full operational control. What do you need from us? I need you to approve a complete restructuring of the executive team, Victoria replied. I need you to support new leadership positions for people who have demonstrated competence and commitment to Pinnacle's success. Robert Kim nodded. What about the current executives? Victoria's expression remained professional but implacable. Effective immediately, their employment with Pinnacle Dynamics is terminated for cause. Richard started to protest, but Victoria held up her hand. You'll receive the severance packages outlined in your contracts, minus the performance bonuses that are voided by termination for cause. The financial implications were staggering. Richard, Amanda, and Michael had been counting on stock options and profit-sharing agreements that would have made them wealthy when Pinnacle went public. Those benefits were now forfeit. This is insane, Amanda said desperately. You can't destroy people's careers because you feel personally slighted. Victoria's laugh was genuinely amused. Amanda, I'm not destroying your careers. Your own incompetence did that. I'm just documenting the results. Sarah Chen was already thinking ahead to the transition challenges. Victoria, what's your timeline for restructuring? The company needs stable leadership during this transition. The new leadership team is already in place, Victoria replied. Dr. Patricia Walsh will become our Chief Technology Officer. Lisa Park will head our new Client Relations Division. Janet Morrison will oversee our Cultural Transformation Initiative. Each appointment made perfect sense to board members who had watched talented employees be systematically marginalized by the outgoing executive team. James Patterson was concerned about market reaction. How do we communicate these changes to clients and investors? With complete transparency, Victoria replied. We're returning to founder leadership after a period of professional management that didn't align with our core values. The corporate euphemism was polite but unmistakable. Everyone in the room understood that Richard and his team were being fired for cause. Robert Kim looked around the table at his fellow board members. Are we in agreement about supporting Victoria's resumption of control? The vote was unanimous. Even faced with comprehensive evidence of mismanagement, the decision was obvious to experienced business people who understood the difference between leadership and destruction. As the former executive team prepared to leave, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in 18 months, complete confidence in Pinnacle's future. The company she'd built would survive, because the people who actually understood its mission were finally back in control. Richard paused at the door, his expression mixing disbelief with something that might have been grudging respect. You planned this from the beginning. Victoria met his gaze steadily. No, Richard, you planned this from the beginning. I just decided how it would end. After they left, Victoria turned her attention to the board members, who would help her rebuild everything that had been damaged. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in 18 months, she was surrounded by people who understood that Pinnacle's strength came from its people, not its politics. The age of executive intimidation was over. The era of collaborative innovation was about to begin. The aftermath of Friday's board meeting unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of corporate restructuring. Within hours of Richard's departure, Victoria had assembled her new leadership team in the same conference room where she'd endured months of humiliation. The irony wasn't lost on her that the space which had witnessed her systematic marginalization would now become the birthplace of Pinnacle's renaissance. Dr. Patricia Walsh sat at the table with the quiet confidence of someone finally being recognized for her expertise. After 18 months of having her technical concerns dismissed as irrelevant details, Patricia was now positioned to prevent the infrastructure disasters that Richard's expansion would have created. Her first recommendation was a comprehensive audit of their current systems to identify vulnerabilities that had been ignored during the rush toward aggressive growth. Lisa Park, the former marketing coordinator who had been systematically excluded from strategic discussions, brought a different perspective to client relations. Where Amanda had viewed clients as revenue sources to be maximized, Lisa understood them as partners whose success was inseparable from Pinnacle's mission. Her client retention strategies were built on strengthening relationships rather than exploiting them. Janet Morrison's new role as Director of Cultural Transformation was perhaps the most crucial appointment. Janet had watched Pinnacle's collaborative culture deteriorate under Richard's authoritarian leadership, and she understood exactly what needed to be rebuilt. Her first initiative would be implementing feedback systems that ensured employee expertise reached decision-makers without fear of retaliation. Victoria looked around the table at these three women who had been overlooked, dismissed, and undervalued by the previous regime. Their appointments weren't charity or political correctness. They were strategic decisions based on demonstrated competence and genuine commitment to Pinnacle's success. Before we discuss operational priorities, Victoria began, I want to address the elephant in the room. This company has just undergone a traumatic leadership change, and our employees deserve to understand what happened and where we're headed. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. People are scared. They've watched 18 months of increasing authoritarianism, and they're not sure whether this change represents genuine improvement or just different management personalities. Lisa leaned forward. Our clients are asking questions too. 3 major accounts called this morning, wanting to understand the leadership transition and what it means for their ongoing projects. Janet's concerns were more fundamental. The culture of fear that Richard created won't disappear overnight. People have learned to keep their heads down and avoid challenging authority. We need to actively demonstrate that expertise and honest feedback are valued. Victoria had anticipated these challenges. We're going to address the entire company Monday morning. Complete transparency about what happened, why it happened, and what changes they can expect going forward. The weekend passed in a blur of strategic planning and operational preparation. Victoria spent Saturday reviewing personnel files, identifying talented employees who had been marginalized or overlooked by the previous leadership. She found pattern after pattern of competent professionals whose expertise had been dismissed because they lacked the corporate pedigree that Richard valued over actual performance. Marcus Chen, a software architect whose innovative solutions had been shelved in favor of more conventional approaches, would be promoted to lead the development team. His technical vision aligned perfectly with Pinnacle's mission of solving complex problems through elegant engineering. Diana Rodriguez, a financial analyst whose budget concerns had been dismissed as excessive caution, would become the new chief financial officer. Her conservative projections might not impress investors seeking dramatic growth, but they would ensure Pinnacle's long-term stability. Thomas Kim, a client services manager whose relationship-building approach had been criticized as inefficient, would head the expanded customer success division. His understanding of client needs would prevent the service quality degradation that had threatened major accounts. Each appointment represented a fundamental shift in Pinnacle's values. Instead of prioritizing impressive credentials and aggressive ambition, Victoria was building a leadership team based on competence, integrity, and alignment with the company's core mission. Sunday evening brought an unexpected phone call that would test Victoria's commitment to her new leadership philosophy. Richard Blackwell's name appeared on her caller ID, and despite every instinct telling her to ignore it, curiosity compelled her to answer. Victoria. Richard's voice was different from the confident executive who had humiliated her just days earlier. I wanted to call and acknowledge what happened on Friday. Victoria waited, saying nothing, allowing him to fill the silence. I've spent the weekend thinking about everything you presented to the board, Richard continued. The documentation, the evidence, the pattern of decisions that prioritized control over collaboration. His voice carried a weight that hadn't been there during his tenure as Pinnacle's COO. I convinced myself that strong leadership meant making tough decisions without being swayed by every employee complaint or technical objection. Victoria remained silent, processing the sincerity in his tone while remembering the casual cruelty he'd displayed during their last interaction. What I realize now, Richard said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, is that I turned into everything I used to criticize about corporate culture. I became the kind of executive who valued obedience over expertise, who confused fear with respect. The admission was significant, but Victoria had seen too many corporate apologies that were more about image management than genuine change. What do you want, Richard? I want to apologize, not just for the way I treated you personally, but for what I did to the company you built. I took something special and tried to turn it into another generic corporate machine. Victoria walked to her apartment window, looking out at the Portland skyline while processing Richard's unexpected contrition. Why are you telling me this? Because I've accepted a position with Meridian Consulting, and they want me to help other companies avoid the mistakes I made at Pinnacle. I can't do that honestly without acknowledging what those mistakes actually were. The irony was striking. Richard would now be consulting other companies about leadership failures that he had personally demonstrated. It was either the perfect form of redemption or the ultimate example of corporate absurdity. I hope you succeed, Victoria said, and meant it. The lessons you learned at Pinnacle's expense might prevent other companies from making the same errors. After ending the call, Victoria reflected on the complexity of corporate relationships and the possibility of genuine change. Richard's apology didn't erase the damage he'd caused, but it suggested that even failed executives could learn from their mistakes and contribute something positive to future organizations. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp energy that accompanies significant change. Victoria arrived at Pinnacle's headquarters 2 hours early, not because she needed the preparation time, but because she wanted to experience the building as its rightful owner, without the psychological burden of deception. Walking through the lobby that had witnessed her humiliating security escort just 4 days earlier felt surreal. The same security guard, David Martinez, was on duty and did a double take when he saw Victoria entering through the main entrance rather than slinking through service corridors. "Ms. Chen," David said, his expression mixing confusion with professional courtesy, "I thought you were no longer with the company." Victoria smiled. "David, there have been some significant changes over the weekend. I'll be addressing the entire staff this morning to explain the situation." The main auditorium was packed by 9 o'clock, filled with employees who had heard rumors about Friday's executive departures, but lacked concrete information about what the changes meant for their jobs and the company's future. Victoria could see the anxiety in their faces, the careful neutrality of people who had learned to avoid taking sides during corporate upheavals. As Victoria walked onto the stage, the room fell silent with the kind of focused attention that accompanies potentially career-altering announcements. These people had endured 18 months of increasing authoritarianism, watching colleagues marginalized for expressing concerns or suggesting alternatives to executive decisions. "Good morning," Victoria began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "I know there's been significant speculation about the leadership changes announced over the weekend, and you deserve to understand exactly what happened and what it means for Pinnacle's future." She paused, making eye contact with employees throughout the auditorium. "For those of you who don't know me personally, my name is Victoria Chen. I founded this company 8 years ago, and I am its owner." The murmur that rippled through the audience was audible but controlled. Even those who had suspected something unusual about the recent changes were surprised by the magnitude of Victoria's revelation. "For the past 6 months, I have been working among you under the consulting identity of Victoria Clare, observing how this company operates and documenting the challenges you face every day." Dr. Patricia Walsh was sitting in the front section, and Victoria could see tears forming in her eyes as the full scope of the situation became clear. "What I discovered was both heartbreaking and infuriating," Victoria continued. "I discovered that talented, dedicated professionals were being systematically silenced while executives made decisions that endangered everything you worked to build." Heads were nodding throughout the audience. These people had lived this reality for 18 months, watching their expertise dismissed, while politically connected executives made strategic choices that ignored operational realities. "I discovered that Pinnacle had lost its way. We had forgotten that our strength comes from the knowledge, creativity, and dedication of people who understand both our technology and our mission." Lisa Park was smiling with obvious relief, finally seeing her marginalization acknowledged by someone with the authority to change it. "Effective immediately, Pinnacle Dynamics is returning to its founding principles," Victoria announced. "Every employee's expertise will be valued, every voice will be heard, every contribution will be recognized." The applause started slowly, but grew stronger, as Victoria's message resonated with people who had been waiting 18 months to hear that their professional judgment mattered. "The expansion strategy that would have pushed you to impossible deadlines while ignoring technical constraints has been canceled. We will grow sustainably based on what our systems can actually support and what our clients actually need." More applause, this time accompanied by visible relief on faces throughout the auditorium. The culture of intimidation that made people afraid to speak up when they identified problems is over. "I want to hear your concerns, your ideas, your solutions. You are the experts in your fields, and this company succeeds when we listen to expertise." Victoria gestured toward Patricia, Lisa, and Janet, who were sitting together in the front section. "Let me introduce you to Pinnacle's new leadership team. Dr. Patricia Walsh, our new Chief Technology Officer, who has spent 3 years preventing system failures while being told her concerns weren't strategic priorities." Patricia stood and waved, her smile radiant as the entire engineering division erupted in sustained applause. "Lisa Park, our new Director of Client Relations, who understands our customers better than anyone in this building but has been systematically excluded from strategic planning." Lisa's recognition was met with equally enthusiastic applause from the client-facing teams who had watched her insights ignored for months. Janet Morrison, our new Director of Cultural Transformation, who will ensure that Pinnacle remains a place where people are treated with dignity and respect. Janet's appointment resonated throughout the auditorium, particularly among the administrative and support staff who had borne the brunt of the previous regime's casual contempt. These appointments aren't based on corporate politics or personal relationships, Victoria emphasized. They're based on demonstrated competence, integrity, and genuine commitment to Pinnacle's success. A hand rose from the middle section of the auditorium. Victoria recognized the questioner as Carlos Mendez, a quality assurance engineer who had been repeatedly criticized for identifying problems that the executive team preferred to ignore. Ms. Chen, what happens to employees who supported the previous leadership? Are we going to be punished for following the policies that were in place? It was exactly the question Victoria had expected and hoped someone would ask. Carlos, absolutely not. You were doing your jobs under difficult circumstances created by failed leadership. The only people being held accountable are those who created those circumstances. The relief in Carlos's expression was visible from the stage, and Victoria could see similar reactions throughout the auditorium. Next week, every department will meet with our new leadership team to discuss priorities, challenges, and improvement opportunities. Your expertise will drive our strategic planning, not the other way around. Another hand rose, this time from Maria Santos, a customer service representative who had been absorbing client complaints about problems she wasn't authorized to solve. What about the clients who have been expressing concerns about service quality? How do we rebuild those relationships? Victoria smiled at the question. Maria, that's exactly the kind of operational expertise we need, driving our client relations strategy. Lisa Park will be working directly with frontline staff to understand client concerns and implement solutions. The transformation in the auditorium's atmosphere was palpable. People who had spent months feeling voiceless and undervalued were beginning to understand that their expertise would finally be heard and respected. Pinnacle Dynamics was built on the principle that technology should solve real problems for real people, Victoria concluded. We lost sight of that principle when we prioritized growth over mission, politics over competence, and control over collaboration. But we're going to rediscover it together. The standing ovation lasted nearly 10 minutes, with employees throughout the auditorium expressing genuine enthusiasm about their company's future for the first time in 18 months. As the auditorium emptied, Victoria was approached by dozens of employees who wanted to express personal appreciation for the changes or share concerns they had been afraid to voice under the previous leadership. The conversations confirmed everything Victoria had suspected about the true state of morale and operational challenges at Pinnacle. The following weeks unfolded with the kind of productive energy that accompanies organizational renewal. Dr. Walsh's infrastructure audit revealed system vulnerabilities that would have created catastrophic failures under Richard's expansion timeline. Her methodical approach to technical planning provided the foundation for sustainable growth based on engineering reality rather than executive fantasy. Lisa Park's client relationship initiatives immediately began reversing the satisfaction decline that had threatened major accounts. By involving frontline service staff in strategic planning, she identified solution opportunities that had been invisible to executives focused on high-level metrics rather than operational details. Janet Morrison's cultural transformation efforts were more complex but equally significant. Rebuilding trust after 18 months of authoritarianism required consistent demonstration that employee feedback would be valued rather than punished. Her anonymous suggestion system allowed people to voice concerns while the new culture established itself. The financial results exceeded even Victoria's optimistic projections. Within 3 months, client satisfaction ratings had returned to pre-executive team levels. Employee retention improved dramatically as talented professionals stopped leaving for companies that valued their expertise. Most significantly, innovation productivity soared as engineers and developers were freed from the bureaucratic constraints that had stifled creativity. The industry recognition followed quickly. Pinnacle Dynamics was featured in TechCrunch as a case study in successful organizational transformation. Harvard Business Review published an analysis of Victoria's infiltration strategy as an innovative approach to diagnosing corporate dysfunction. Forbes named her one of the year's most innovative CEOs for her unconventional method of reclaiming corporate control. But the moment that meant the most to Victoria came 6 months after the board meeting revelation, during Pinnacle's quarterly all-hands meeting. As she looked out at an auditorium filled with engaged, enthusiastic employees who felt valued and heard, she realized that the company she had envisioned 8 years ago had finally become reality. The question and answer session was particularly telling. Instead of the careful neutrality that had characterized meetings under Richard's leadership, employees were actively proposing solutions, challenging assumptions, and collaborating on complex technical problems. The culture of fear had been replaced by genuine intellectual curiosity and professional engagement. Marcus Chen, the newly promoted development team leader, raised his hand to address a scheduling challenge. Victoria, we've been discussing the Q3 release timeline, and the engineering team thinks we can accelerate delivery by 2 weeks if we restructure the testing protocol. Under the previous regime, such a suggestion would have been dismissed as technical minutiae irrelevant to strategic planning. Victoria's response demonstrated the fundamental shift in Pinnacle's decision-making culture. Marcus, what would you need to make that timeline work without compromising quality standards? The conversation that followed involved input from quality assurance, client services, and project management teams, resulting in a collaborative solution that improved both delivery speed and product reliability. It was exactly the kind of cross-functional problem-solving that had made Pinnacle successful in its early years. The meeting concluded with Victoria's announcement that Pinnacle had been selected as the primary technology partner for a major automotive manufacturer's supply chain optimization project. The contract represented not just significant revenue but validation that their commitment to technical excellence and client partnership was being recognized by industry leaders. As employees filed out of the auditorium, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The betrayal, humiliation, and systematic marginalization she had endured had been painful, but they had also provided insights into corporate dysfunction that no business school could have taught. More importantly, the experience had reinforced her conviction that sustainable success required aligning business strategy with human values. Companies that treated employees as expendable resources rather than valuable partners might achieve short-term profits, but they would ultimately fail when their best people left for organizations that respected their contributions. That evening, Victoria received an unexpected email from Richard Blackwell. The subject line read, "Congratulations and gratitude." And despite her initial skepticism about his motives, the message's content surprised her with its genuine humility. "Victoria, I saw the TechCrunch article about Pinnacle's transformation, and I wanted to congratulate you on building something truly special. The employee satisfaction metrics and innovation indicators are extraordinary, and they demonstrate everything I misunderstood about effective leadership. I'm writing from Minneapolis, where I'm helping a manufacturing company avoid the mistakes I made at Pinnacle. When executives here suggest dismissing employee expertise or prioritizing control over collaboration, I share the documentation you presented to our board meeting. It's become a case study in how quickly authoritarian leadership can destroy organizational culture. I know my apologies can't undo the damage I caused, but I want you to know that the lessons learned from my failures at Pinnacle are helping other companies preserve what makes them special. Perhaps that's the most positive outcome I can create from such a destructive period. Thank you for showing me that true leadership means serving the people you lead, not exploiting them. Pinnacle's success under your restored leadership proves that competence and character will always triumph over politics and credentials." Victoria read the message twice, processing Richard's apparent transformation from corporate authoritarian to organizational reformer. While she remained skeptical about the depth of his change, she appreciated his acknowledgement of the damage caused and his commitment to preventing similar failures elsewhere. The real validation came from unexpected sources over the following months. Dr. Patricia Walsh was invited to speak at the National Engineering Conference about technical leadership in corporate environments. Lisa Park's client relationship strategies were adopted by industry associations as best practices for customer success management. Janet Morrison's cultural transformation methodology was featured in organizational psychology journals as an innovative approach to rebuilding trust after executive failures. Each recognition reflected not just individual achievement, but validation of Victoria's fundamental belief that expertise and character were more valuable than credentials in politics. The people who had been marginalized under Richard's leadership were now being recognized as industry leaders in their respective fields. The ultimate measure of Pinnacle's transformation came during their annual client conference, where customer testimonials provided unfiltered feedback about the company's evolution. Thomas Kim, now heading the Customer Success Division, had organized presentations that demonstrated how Pinnacle's renewed focus on partnership rather than profit maximization had improved client outcomes. Jennifer Walsh, the technology director at Thompson Manufacturing, who had been Pinnacle's first client 8 years earlier, delivered the keynote address that captured the essence of what made Victoria's approach special. "I've worked with dozens of technology vendors over the past decade," Jennifer said, "and most of them view clients as revenue opportunities to be maximized rather than partners to be supported. Pinnacle has always been different, but that difference became even more pronounced over the past year." She clicked to a slide showing productivity improvements that Thompson had achieved through Pinnacle's solutions. "These results weren't possible when we were working with a vendor focused on expansion and profit margins. They became achievable when we started working with partners who understood that our success was inseparable from their mission." The testimonial continued with specific examples of how Pinnacle's collaborative approach had solved complex logistical challenges that other vendors had dismissed as too complicated or unprofitable to address. Each example demonstrated the competitive advantage that came from valuing long-term relationships over short-term revenue maximization. As Victoria listened to Jennifer's presentation, she realized that the client conference represented more than business success. It was validation that the values she had fought to preserve were not just morally superior to Richard's authoritarian approach, but practically more effective in achieving sustainable growth and client satisfaction. The conference concluded with the announcement that Pinnacle Dynamics had been selected as the exclusive technology partner for a consortium of manufacturing companies implementing next-generation supply chain systems. The contract represented the largest deal in Pinnacle's history, but more importantly, it demonstrated that their commitment to excellence and partnership was being recognized by the most sophisticated buyers in their market. That evening, as Victoria stood in her office looking out at the Portland skyline, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from garage startup founder to corporate infiltrator to vindicated CEO. The path had been more complex and painful than anything she could have imagined when she first started Pinnacle 8 years earlier, but the complexity had also provided insights that would have been impossible to gain through conventional business experience. She now understood how quickly organizational culture could deteriorate under poor leadership, how talented people responded when their expertise was valued versus dismissed, and how sustainable success required aligning business strategy with human dignity. Most importantly, Victoria had learned that true leadership meant creating conditions where other people could achieve their potential, rather than hoarding authority to preserve personal power. The executives she had promoted weren't successful because they owed their positions to her favor. They were successful because she had identified their existing competence and provided the organizational support necessary for them to excel. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Patricia Walsh. "Victoria, I just wanted to thank you again for making this transformation possible. Working at Pinnacle feels like being part of something meaningful again, rather than just surviving corporate politics." The message was followed by similar texts from Lisa Park and Janet Morrison, each expressing gratitude for the opportunity to contribute their expertise to an organization that valued substance over style, competence over credentials, and collaboration over control. As Victoria prepared to leave her office, she paused at the conference table, where she had endured months of humiliation and dismissal. The same mahogany surface that had witnessed her systematic marginalization had also hosted the meetings where her new leadership team planned Pinnacle's renaissance. The symbolism was perfect. Spaces, like organizations, could be transformed by the people who occupied them and the values they brought to their work. Richard's authoritarian approach had turned the conference room into a place of fear and intimidation. Victoria's collaborative leadership had restored it as a center of innovation and strategic thinking. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, competitive pressures, and operational complexities that would test Pinnacle's renewed culture and expanded capabilities. But Victoria faced those challenges with complete confidence in her team's ability to address them, through the same combination of technical expertise, ethical commitment, and collaborative problem-solving that had built the company's reputation. The woman who had been dismissed as pathetic and irrelevant was now leading a company that had become the gold standard for organizational culture and technical excellence in their industry. Sometimes the best revenge was simply being right about what actually mattered for sustainable success. As Victoria drove home through the Portland evening, she thought about the young entrepreneur who had started this journey 8 years ago, believing that technology could solve real problems and that business could be conducted with integrity and respect. That woman had been tested by betrayal and humiliation, but she had also been validated by the ultimate triumph of competence over politics, substance over style, and character over credentials. The battle for Pinnacle Dynamics was over. The war for organizational excellence would continue every day, in every decision, through every interaction between leaders and the people they served. But Victoria was confident that the principles she had fought to preserve would continue guiding Pinnacle toward a future worthy of the vision that had started it all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.